There are films which serve as a buffet of story and ideas a viewer can place before themselves and be served. The film asks very little of the audience. It knows the aches and the pains and the escapist needs of the viewer, and so it says gently to them, "Don't get up. I've got this." And proceeds to serve the moviegoer until, and in many cases, beyond their fill. All is accounted for, mysteries are solved, loose ends get tied, and we get to go on a bit of a ride through it all, and we ooh and ah at the spectacle of it. These are the thrill rides of cinema. Only God Forgives is not one of these movies. Whether we are better for it is a matter of your tastes. Directed by budding auteur Nicholas Refn, who helmed the dark, brilliant, and nightmarish Drive, one expects a certain pretentiousness. There is more than a whiff of it all over Only God Forgives, and indeed, the film has polarized critics and audiences alike, with about half loving it and about half considering it art-house garbage. The movie contains the barest conceit of a plot. Small-time drug lord and kickboxing bookmaker Julian has been tasked by his gangster mother to avenge the death of his brother, and ends up confronting something like a force of nature in the character of Chang, a retired police inspector who has started meting out his own brand of justice while not singing karaoke at cop bars. The influence upon this film are obvious. You can draw fairly straight lines to grittier David Lynch work, Gaspar Noé, Enter the Void in particular, Chen Park, Old Boy fame, and classic Asian crime dramas. Like Drive, it was also dedicated to Alejandro Jodorowsky, Refn being a new generation of art warriors inspired by the maniac Mexican. The pedigree of how it all comes together is very solid. Ryan Gosling is ostensibly the star of this film, but he probably speaks about 20 lines in the whole affair. Most of the time he is brooding, a living set piece after a fashion. His Julian comes off as a bit of an empty vessel. The real stars are Kristen Scott Thomas with a totally wackadoodle performance as Julian's trashy gangster mother, and Thai actor, with the greatest of respect to this lovely Thai gentleman, Vitava Pen Sringram, as the terrifying and inevitable Chang. The only things Only God Forgives are willing to give up for the price of admission and nothing more is this totally stunning and vibrant cinematography and a score that throbs with menace and tension. That's what you get if you aren't willing to engage the film, and many people will call that a failure. However, let me say this. The times I am most affected by a film is when there is room for mystery, when there are gaps I must fill with my own feelings, experiences, and impressions. Refn declines to do any of that heavy lifting for us, to tell us what the movie is ultimately about, and some will say he has done a disservice to us for doing so, but I disagree. Leaving the cup half full, or half empty, as you may see it, lets the viewer pour a bit of themselves into the cocktail and personalize the drunk. You need to work a bit to find more here than pretty images and a good soundtrack, but the work can be rewarding. I came to see Julian as a man faced with impossible choices. Choices that make him a monster or a failure. He fantasizes about not being able to act, not being able to choose. His desire for bondage and non-interaction is a desire to be released from the consequences of his choices. When he succumbs to choice and attempts to take a stand against Chang, he is mercilessly emasculated. I really enjoyed that the director was willing to take this handsome, strong Ryan Gosling and just unman him. It was a bold choice and demonstrates the premise. Julian's dead brother had no problem making choices and didn't care about the consequences, and he was loved. Julian, the cautious child, the one who wants to tread lightly and who understands when you make a fist, it means people are getting hurt, is constantly being upstaged by his brother's memory. Not only is his brother willing to take merciless action, so is their nemesis, Chang. In many ways, we know Julian has no real chance. He was not made for the world he inhabits, and he will suffer for it. He wants the freedom only one man can really give him. Inaction is an action in and of itself, but requires a discipline that Julian lacks. He needs assistance from an unlikely source. Of course, I didn't get a sense of all this while I was watching the movie. I was absorbed in what was happening on the screen and wrapped up in the tension and the weird, liquid smooth movements of Chang, certain, determined, relentless, and inevitable. This is what I had to pour into the half-empty vessel Refn put in front of me. I found myself coming back to certain imagery and trying to determine how I felt about it, and it frankly took a while to get a real sense of what I thought the movie meant. To me, this is an achievement of art over passive entertainment. There's a time to be spoon-fed mushy bananas, and there's time to enjoy a meal that will challenge your palate. I don't judge the former as harshly as some, but Only God Forgives is definitely the latter. To enjoy it, you will need to bring something to it, an offering of the self. Otherwise, the glass will only ever be half full.
Excellent job as always, Dave. I can't thank you enough for that. That was awesome. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that coinciding with this episode, we had an opportunity to talk to Larry Smith, the director of photography on Only God Forgives, and Bronson and Fear X. He's worked with Refn a few times. He also DP'd Stanley Kubrick's last movie, Eyes Wide Shut. You can check that interview out at thecuttingroompodcast.com. It'll be right with this episode. Joe, Dave is coming at us with a big bang here. We're talking about Nicholas Refn. We're talking about Cliff Martinez. Dave mentions how Smith and Martinez kind of combine their beautiful forces to tell a great story. As powerful as this movie is, guys, it's it is very passive. It is very quiet. It's one of the most interesting films I've seen in a very long time. It's without a doubt one of the most beautiful looking films I've seen probably since Eyes Wide Shut. It's absolutely interesting. Joe, let's start off with your feelings about what Dave just said, and you're the one who designed this program.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about Cliff Martinez, but let's get a reaction from you with what Dave just said.
Yeah, Dave, very well done as always. And the biggest difficulty here is trying to figure out where to start with what you wrote, man. I mean, you brought up so many different points, man. The way into it is difficult. Some of those are great, and I took a lot, hit a lot of the notes that you were. I wrote down some of the points that you were saying, but just to start, Tom, just to what I guess we can enter this through the sound thing,
right?
And why I do, and you did bring that up, and I think that I had Cliff Martinez's Solaris soundtrack in my iTunes, and it comes up every once in a while, and I just every time I hear it, and I have these studio speakers, it's just lovely and beautiful, and so I'm like, let me look at the films that Cliff Martinez has worked on, because and then all of a sudden I see all these interesting films, and I'm like, wow, this is a really neat way to kind of look at movies. Like we're usually looking at movies through genre or director or some other type of thing, and I just thought that this would be an interesting way into a way to look at a collection of films. And it's just odd how all of the films that we're watching tonight, they all have this otherworldly thing, and they're all like weird art pieces, and kind of like they're all beautifully shot, in my opinion anyway. Mm-hmm. They all look really beautiful, and they sound really beautiful. So these are really fine delicacies, to use that food metaphor, these are really solidly made films. And I think that they're all, like, in one way or another, they're all open, you know what I mean, for interpretation. They're all art house stuff. So it's just weird how this guy's music fits that, is compatible with the films that are decidedly art house and not spoon-fed stuff. You know what I mean?
When you're dealing with a movie that Refn is doing here, where the dialogue is just so minimal, so he has to rely heavily on music. I mean, from the composer, he's got to rely heavily on the photography, and he has to rely heavily on what that photography is capturing to tell the story, more so than what dialogue normally moves the story along. But in this case, the music and the emotion from the actors and putting all that into a bowl and mixing it up is really what's telling the story here, Joe, and that's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it's style, you know. It's
Style, yeah.
these are artistic visions, you know, and the directors here are all so different, but all really you know, extremely talented, moving toward genius, probably
Mhm.
all three of them in a sense that we're going to be
Right.
talking about
Right.
Karine
What
and
so what Joe's talking about is next week we're going to be continuing the Cliff Martinez theme, obviously, and we're going to be talking about Steven Soderbergh's Solaris and Harmony Korine's Spring Breakers. And the name Cliff Martinez never meant anything to me before Joe. And the first movie, and let's just talk about Martinez just for a second because he is the subject here, and he never really meant anything to me. I never really even noticed him, and 10 minutes into watching Solaris, I'm like, all right, I think something's going to be happening here over the next week
yeah, it's
in my
cool, isn't it? It
screens.
was, and you know, these are all movies that I had seen just once before. And then, like I said, I saw him pop up on my iTunes, and then I was like, oh, he's done all these, you know, he's done all these movies, and I'm like, you know, all of these movies deserve a second viewing because just like Davey, what you were saying is that, you know, these are films that resonate, or you're not sure what to make of them while you're watching them, and you could sort of sort it out, you know, the next day or whatever when you're driving, whatever the hell the case may be.
Right,
So I was like, oh yeah, it would be neat to go and take a look at these films again, you know, and I'm
right,
sort of glad I did, you know.
right, right. Dave mentions Gosling's performance and Kristen Scott Thomas's performances, and they're both absolutely brilliant. Gosling, especially Dave, because it's so funny. And I think I mentioned this to Billy. I don't know if we did it on air during our Larry Smith interview, but he really reminds me of Nicolas Cage when Cage is really good. You get what I'm saying, Dave?
Yeah, like Leaving Las Vegas era
Right. Where
Cage.
like his face is just telling the story,
Absolutely, hundred
and
percent.
that's what I was just, I was totally
This
zoning into
jacket
that.
is a symbol of my individuality.
But
Well, like that point that you made, David, he's a vessel, you know what I mean? Like I think I
Totally.
even saw an interview, like an interview of him. He was saying, you know, I don't think he's thinking about much. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
no, there just seems to be this like he's just not part of that world, you know? Like he just doesn't want to be there. He
mm.
does not want to be there.
Yeah, and
right.
you brought up emasculation a lot in this
Mhm.
too, and I thought that was really interesting because I mean, obviously his mother's freaking beating the shit out of him all
Fuck.
time, right? That's crazy.
She verbally terrorizes him, right?
Well,
Throughout.
he said, well, what did she say? His brothers had a much bigger cock than he has, or
Yeah,
something.
Yeah.
that
That's
was a little disturbing.
Yeah. I know. I mean, that scene where they're at the dinner table and he hires that a woman to be there with him to act like they're a couple.
Oof.
What does she use? What the
Cum dumpster.
cum? Yeah, and I was reading about that, and that was like Refn had asked Gosling to write down a list of words that are just thoroughly insulting. The worst words. The worst things you could say to a woman, and they, on top of his list was the word "cum dumpster," and Refn gave it to Kristen Scott Thomas, who's just absolutely just mesmerizing in this movie.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, I
She's so
it's
fucking good.
it's so
She's
funny.
so
Yeah,
fucking good.
there's
It's
nothing
ridiculous.
better sometimes in cinema to me when when an actress has this role where she's like the most evil person on the planet,
It's great.
and it's like it goes back with me to like, Freaks or Angela who was it? Angela Lansbury in The Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah.
You
Or
know,
the best, the most obvious one is the Nurse Cratchit in
right? Yeah, Louise Fletcher, and my personal favorite is Nicole Kidman in To Die For, who's just pure evil.
I haven't seen.
You haven't seen, you never saw To Die.
No, I haven't
Oh,
seen it in a long time. It's been a
yeah,
while, you know.
yeah. Not to get off subject, but I did see a Gus. I watched Drugstore Cowboy recently, and Joe, real quick, we got to get Van Zandt on here one of these days, man, because he's awesome. Let's get Billy, and Billy and I talked to Larry Smith. I think Billy still is just in awe of that. of that conversation. I've never seen. I could have had Ryan Gosling on, and Billy would have been like, "Nah, I don't want anything to do with that interview."
I have been on cloud nine since then. There's no doubt about it.
Billy, I've been like, I feel like you and I have really drawn closer since I produced that for, not just you, but for the show and for the fans.
You saw me at my most vulnerable.
You were awesome. He was like taking control. At some point, I'm like, when fans, when you get a chance to listen to it, man, Barassa and Smith just really start nerding out on DP stuff.
It's not what you think. It's not the DP you're thinking.
Yeah, you got to be careful with that term, John.
My bad. We should be careful.
We nerded out on DP stuff.
Yeah.
DP.
There's your headline: Larry Smith and Billy Barassa nerded out on DP stuff.
Yeah. Put that into the queue for the graphic design for this program, Joe.
Yeah, but Billy, you're in awe of Larry Smith, and I'm sure Refn has been on your radar with Drive and Bronson. We kind of talked a little bit about Only God Forgives at the end of the Larry Smith interview, and we backed off and we said, we wanted to save it. So I'm really interested in hearing, on what you're hearing from us and what you heard from Dave and what you think about Refn and Gosling and Smith and Kristen Scott Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, Dave, I love your analogy of the glass half full, half empty, because the first movie of Refn's that I saw was that crazy Viking movie. I can't remember the name of it.
Valhalla Rising.
Yeah. Valhalla Rising. And I was like, I saw it on Netflix and I was like, it just looks like shit. It just looks like one of these low budget,
like
Conan knockoffs.
Channel kind of deal.
Yeah, exactly. And but every once in a while you read reviews and the vote is just completely split down the middle, and people love it or hate it, and that always kind of raises my interest because Killing Them Softly, which is one of my favorite movies that I've seen in years, bombed at the box office and the vote was split. Turned out to be a masterpiece, So I checked out that Valhalla Rising, and it's not my favorite movie ever, but I was like, this guy knows what the fuck he's doing. Like it's so like down on simmer. It's so minimalist that I wanted, then I went to check out his other stuff and just fell in love with him. Drive is a masterpiece. And I think Only God Forgives is just amazing. I've seen it probably 3 or 4 times at this point. So yeah, I just think it's great. I love the minimalism of it. I love that everything is build up and not necessarily payoff. When there is a payoff, it's worth it, but he keeps everything on, simmer the whole time. So and that the look of it obviously is stunning, and that the Martinez score is even long before the show came on the radar, I was listening to the Only God Forgives soundtrack pretty regularly just because I think it's his best. I think it's his best score so far.
What is with you guys? You know what? I've never done that, like listen to scores for films. It's weird that I haven't done that, Joe. And like you and Billy seem to be all over it. I feel like I'm missing out
once in a while. It's cool just once in a while. It'll pop up. But,
of course. Yeah.
Just doing a lot of editing and audio editing, I just tend to get them collecting. The Solaris I had used as a temporary music for Time Travelers actually. Yeah. That's how it got in there. But all this stuff for the show, it always just gets into my. What I do a lot of editing, here audio editing and movie editing, so it gets incorporated. And when I'm looking for like moods and stuff for like whatever I'm doing, I listen to a whole shitload of soundtracks, So and this one, whenever Solaris comes on, man, it's so textured and like it's just such a nice score.
I honestly was so impressed, Joe. The minute I started watching Solaris, first of all, you're watching Soderbergh, and like the first 20 minutes of that film is absolutely extraordinary. But that music is just unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Man, I today while I was working, I just was clicking on all of his soundtracks on YouTube actually, and Only God. It's like
why haven't I noticed this dude before? Because and I mentioned this to Billy that, and I don't mean this to any disrespect to Cliff Martinez. I don't know why I would even think that it was disrespectful, but it goes back to our days in horror, I guess. And Dave, I think you might have an understanding of what I'm saying here. That Cliff Martinez, like that music, the music that he does, it's very John Carpenter-esque, and it has that really unique, like synthesized style to it. With that pounding and it just
throbs. Man.
It
throbs, and it feels dangerous.
Right, and I'm like thinking to myself, I'm like, geez, it's like when I first started watching Solaris, and I hate that I keep bringing that up because we should be talking about that next.
I know,
but I was like, just like it made me think of like Christine and Escape from New York, just the way those films sound. And the way Carpenter, even Halloween, in a sense, and I love.
It's like I feel like the styles are obviously much different, but I know what you're saying. Like it feels like there's air in the room. When you're listening to it, it's got a depth to it. It's like
it's minimalism. I mean,
right.
it's very, very limited notes and repetitive motifs and everything.
Absolutely.
And it's great. I actually think we're kind of in a little golden age of composer and director collaboration. I used to get confused between Cliff Martinez and Clint Mansell because Martinez
all the time, Billy.
Yeah, whatever, dude. So Martinez works with Soderbergh and Refn a lot. Clint Mansell scores all of Darren Aronofsky's movies.
Oh, wow. All right.
Yeah, and the Requiem for a Dream, like that Lux Aeterna track off of that soundtrack became, for 10 years you couldn't go to the theater without hearing that piece of music in a movie trailer. And the Fountain is one of my favorite film scores of recent years. Absolutely beautiful piece. But it's and then you've got Trent Reznor and David Fincher,
and Atticus,
and you've got
that guy Atticus. Who Reznor actually.
Atticus. I know who you're Atticus Finch or something.
He's a lawyer too.
I'm kidding. So and then probably for my money, the greatest composer working in film right now, Johnny Greenwood, working with P.T. Anderson. Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead. And there's so much good music coming out of these guys' films right now. It's kind of amazing.
Or Mothersbaugh and Wes Anderson.
Who is this?
Mark Mothersbaugh from Devo and
Devo, man.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah. I think
that was a thing.
Yeah, they've worked together a couple times. I believe. I hope I'm right about that because I think.
Yeah. They've done. Yeah. They did like Life Aquatic. I'm pretty sure he scored all of the movies.
Right. Yeah, and again, Danny Elfman and Tim Burton, I think, is a real popular one too, right?
Yes, I just think that like what has happened with this particular group of guys is that they've grown up with the Philip Glasses and the Steve Reichs, and they've John Cage and all of these composers who just sort of tore music to pieces and started from scratch, and it's great, man. I mean, it's like in the days in the 70s when Lalo Schifrin was doing the Bullet soundtrack or something, and all of a sudden there was this Latin jazz and all this stuff that no one had ever heard of before, or Kubrick was famous for it. He'd take friggin' Georgi Ligeti. And no one had ever heard any of that stuff used as film music before. So, yeah, I think it's great, man. I just think it's kind of it's nice to hear this sort of music finally filtering into movies.
Right. And what's interesting to me, Joe, is you mentioned Trent Reznor, and I brought up Danny Elfman and Mark Mothersbaugh, and you could throw in Stuart Copeland and a few other people there. They all come from rock and roll.
Yeah, it's true. I wonder if this current crop, when we look back on it in 15, 20 years, if it's going to look like the 80s. It's just so funny because you really like the music really gives a characteristic to the film, and they're
going to say, "Oh, that's so 2015."
Yeah, I'll listen to the that electronic minimalism. It must be the 2000s. You know what I mean? And just the same way as the Bernstein soundtracks, they all sort of sound the same. But once in a while,
the 70s cop movie, or the John Carpenter 80s slasher.
Yeah,
movie,
it's great because when you start thinking about music and film, you really can place music plays much more of a it plays much bigger part when you're trying to place a movie in a time period than you actually think about. Like a spaghetti western right off the bat.
Right.
It's just amazing that you don't think about it so much, but it's so heavily influences the style of a film.
Yeah, and especially with Refn and Martinez in this one, and I can't stress that enough because this movie relies more on what Martinez is doing than a normal film would.
I think that what I'm finding out about the Martinez sort of approach is that they're, like I was mentioned before, it's so compatible with films that are, very open-ended and left open for meaning, and, kind of breaks apart traditional, story structures and narrative and spoon feeding. It creates this other world or this hyper world, and it just asks you to enter it and try to figure out what the fuck is going on, which I would love to hear what people think was going on, because I still really...
Yeah, I was going to ask you guys if you wanted to fill the other half of that glass each in turn. One last comment on that, though. I love Only God Forgives. The DVD is well worth getting, in addition to, if you just want to watch it on Instant or whatever. But the behind-the-scenes stuff is really fun. There's about an hour of footage of Refn working. His wife shot behind-the-scenes footage the entire time they were shooting in Thailand. And there's actually a documentary that she produced based off of this coming out this year sometime. It just showed up in a festival in Europe somewhere, and looking forward to seeing that. But there's plenty of that footage already on the DVD as well, and it's really interesting to see them shooting. It was very, garage band production type stuff. And in fact, they talk a lot about how the script had a little bit more explanatory dialogue, a little more exposition and all this stuff. And while they were shooting, Refn was just basically chopping out paragraph after paragraph of dialogue. And then even there's a famous scene in the movie where one guy is being interrogated, and as he starts to speak, the soundtrack goes silent and the music fades in. And apparently the guy's accent was too strong to understand what he was saying, or it sounded really funny in English. So Refn just muted him and told Martinez, this is what the guy's saying, make music that sounds like what he's trying to express,
So you're saying, Billy, that the script was heavier in dialogue. And this, and that
Larry Smith actually.
This concept developed over the shoot.
Yeah, and you can tell it's a movie that's very heavily developed in editing. Obviously, it's like, it's kind of like this and Solaris are almost the montage approach to filmmaking, where the entire movie is a montage.
Right.
And Larry Smith actually mentions in our interview that it was never, the densest script ever, but a substantial amount of dialogue was chopped out of it. So
right.
Yeah, but that glass half full thing. Anyone want to supply some meaning to this abstract little nut job?
We're talking about Dave's point where the viewer, like Refn, where he feels that Refn challenges the viewer to bring something within themselves to the viewing. Is that what we're talking about, Billy?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Joe, you got anything there, buddy?
You don't want to weigh in.
Hey, you're the smartest cat on the show.
That's what Max. That's what Max says with the passive aggressive, knife in my back.
I just think that's a perfect question for you. And I'm not trying to.
I mean, it's heavily driven by theme, right? Like, it's obvious. The plot is like, Dave, what you were saying. It's glaringly simple. There's a guy gets killed and his family takes revenge, one way or another. And the mother, the stuff that's actually happening is actually really simple. It's just that there's all this other thematic stuff kind of underpinning everything, and the stuff with the hands and all this stuff. I mean, I don't know.
Internal, right? Everything seems to be happening internally.
There's parts that seem to be like bits of hallucination or imagination or whatever. Yeah, hallucinatory, like the stuff where the samurai swords coming down and chopping off limbs in black. That there seems to be like definitely abstraction going on. But I mean, if you just start with the title, only God forgives. That's where I was sort of starting to try to piece things together. There's plenty I can't even, figure out what he means. But, so Gosling forgives that guy for killing his brother. And then he undergoes for the rest of the movie.
It sets off a terrible chain of events.
Yeah, basically,
thereby.
maybe the cop is a God figure, and he's allowed to forgive, but Gosling's not allowed to forgive him because he takes it upon himself that he thinks he has the right to forgive instead of exacting revenge. Like we were talking about last time, Tom. Instead of exacting revenge, then he has to pay the price.
Right. More revenge. That's what it's so funny. We continue the revenge.
Yeah, no, it does play into it, but I mean, I think that's definitely at the heart of it somewhere. Right. Is Gosling, about to kill the guy who murdered his brother, and then not doing it, and then what he undergoes thereafter is part of his penance,
Mm. Dave?
That's very intelligent, Joe. I think your reputation remains intact.
Thank you.
All I want to know is what his obsession with karaoke was.
Yeah, right.
That was great. I regarded that as, I did think of that dude as a God figure, and I regarded that as him preaching to the congregation.
Oh, wow.
Or like God.
Awesome.
Or like God telling orders to his angels, Like, I just thought that was a completely mystical, like, preacher-esque setting. I thought that was freaking great.
Wow. Gentlemen, anything else on Nicholas Refn's Only God Forgives? I'm going to be wrapping things up in just a couple
I
minutes.
have a question for you,
Sure.
Tom. Just, this...
For me personally?
Yeah, well, for anybody, I guess. But, I know sometimes, you were having trouble with Von Trier for a while there. Sometimes you don't like film.
Yeah.
It irks you or gets under your skin sometimes. I think when like they were saying, it's hard to figure out what that is. Does that bug you on this one?
No, not at all. I really liked Drive, and I've seen, I watched Bronson and Drive before we even brought Refn to the table here, so I was familiar with his work, and I think I know what you're saying, where where the director kind of puts himself like above like the storytelling, with his style,
or asks you to work. He's like, and then you kind of feel like you're missing something or you're not understanding it properly.
Yeah.
Or something
This, we see. I think with this, what Refn, there is kind of a story here that begins, and you go through these experiences with characters, and there's an end to it. So there's like this coherency there, where I don't really see that with someone like Von Trier per se. You know what I'm saying? Where it's a little bit more complicated. There's not.
How do you see the difference, Tom? I'm sorry, I'm curious.
I'm saying that I think that Refn, like at its heart, he simplifies everything by giving you a story that's pretty easy to follow.
I feel I totally agree with you. I think he's actually taking the exploitation genre, which has very readable plots, and doing something with it, as opposed to Von Trier, who's a little more abstract with his plots. You're saying?
Yeah, I'm saying it's like songwriting. It's like it's like how I would compare, like, say, Elvis Costello. Like, two of my favorites are like Elvis Costello and Paul Westerberg, where Costello will take something simple and complicate it with fancy words, and try to be smarter than the subject. Whereas Paul Westerberg will do it oppositely, where he'll take something that's complicated and simplify it with easier words to follow.
That's interesting,
and
that is a really good point.
And I think that I could dig Refn's work because he's more of a Paul Westerberg than Von Trier's Elvis Costello.
You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen.
That's actually a hell of a point.
That is a hell of a good point. Well put, Tom.
Thank you. No shit. That was a hell of a good point, Tom.
Yeah, and I think you just nailed the point, that something that I really enjoy about Refn is that he does take the complicated and boils it down to the simple. And in doing so, sometimes it leaves it too simplistic for some people because you can read multiple interpretations into that simplified form.
But that's the best. That's
the fun of it.
Of
That's
course
the
it is. Yeah. And that's, and Joe, I mean, that's the best answer I could give about what my experience with watching someone like Von Trier and watching someone like this. That's the big difference to me, and that's why I could watch Refn. I could continue to watch him. Whereas like Von Trier, it's like I'm like just waiting for that freaking Dropbox schedule.
There's nothing to grab onto, right?
Yeah, not for me.
There's nothing to grab on.
Not for me.
I mean, I think that there is a point to leaning on genre because you are from like what Billy was saying is that there is something simple like I was saying that the plot is extremely simple. It's a simple revenge plot.
You get to do shorthand.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so you have something to hold on to while you're looking at all this weird stuff that's very emotional, So you don't have to be concerned so much with actually what's happening if you're not following it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Where with Von Trier, there's so much stuff and you're not sure what to follow or where it's going or why you're following it. It's a mass confusion, and it's like a cacophony of stuff. Where here there's like something very clearly defined plot to hold on to, and so all the emotional stuff that he puts on top of it, the dreamlike stuff.
Right.
You can
feel
more at ease while you try to enter it.
Absolutely, and that's why I could, I think like Lynch, like when Lynch does Eraserhead, there's the same thing that Refn is doing. There's like you have an understanding of a story, or even better, like the Blue Velvet is a great example. It's an even better example.
Yeah,
where you could have all these little images and these little scenes and these words spoken that might be so out there, but he never relinquishes from the fact that he's telling a story that has a beginning, middle, and an end,
and it's one that's familiar. It's basically like Blue Velvet is
exactly
a noir,
exactly,
yeah.
And so that there's an investigation going on. There's a guy who's very clearly needs to figure out what's going on, and then on top, how it's being told, the language that's being used references some of the genre stuff, but then it takes it into, again, something that's dreamlike, abstract, or emotional,
Right, absolutely.
So we can say then that the cup is half empty or half full.
There you go. Yeah.
Guys, I want to thank you, all three of you, very much for talking about Nicholas Refn and beginning our journey with Cliff Martinez. I want to remind everybody that they could once again check out. Billy and I had a great opportunity to talk to Larry Smith. He was the director of photography on this film, Only God Forgives. He's also worked with Refn in the past, Bronson, Fear X, and he shot Stanley Kubrick's last film, Eyes Wide Shut, something that we're all in awe of. And as film fans, I'm sure you are too. Check that out. It's right on our website, right next to this episode. The Cutting Room Movie Podcast is brought to you by Christiana Productions and New Media Limited. The show is edited and co-produced by Joseph Schreck and produced by Thomas Detloff and Joe Christiana. We'd also like to thank our associate producer, Jeremy Garcia of Dartboard Cinema. He's hard at work on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that craziness. You could like us on Facebook.
And if you haven't been over there to see Max's video of Tom, get over there and look at it. It's the best thing that ever happened to the show.
Oh, to you, Joe.
To me.
To you and the Christiana family, I'm sure, at breakfast time.
Yes, we watch it every breakfast.
So get over there, like us on Facebook at the Cutting Room Movie Podcast, and you can follow me on Twitter, Thomas Detloff, at TCRM Podcast. You can also check out Joe's film work at ChristianaProductions.com. Check out Max Cook's and Adam Shoulders Bowler Hat Productions and their Mimosa podcast show at maxcookandthecounselor.com. And check out Max's blog at maxcookuncorked.com. He just put up something recently about, he just read the novel Sideways, so he's very excited about that. Max Cook, Uncorked.com. What was he yelling at you about, Joe, with the read the Count of Monte Cristo?
That's what I heard the whole review. He's yelling at me. What male adult reads the Count of Monte Cristo
During the summertime.
When else are you going to read the Count of Monte Cristo? You don't read that shit in the winter.
He wasn't happy with that. Music from the Cutting Room is done by our friends, the Zillatones. Check them out at www.thezillatones.com or search for the Zillatones at ReverbNation.com. We're going to be back next week. We're going to be talking more Cliff Martinez. We're going to be doing Steven Soderbergh's Solaris and Harmony Korine's Spring Breakers. We can't wait to sink our teeth into both of them. We're also going to find out what's going on with Dave Pace's novel. So check back with us next week. Until then, we are over and we are out. Ciao.
Next time to satisfy more of your strange desires. The Cutting Room Movie Podcast. We do chicken right.
Pen Sringram as the terrifying and inevitable Chang. The only things Only God Forgives are willing to give up for the price of admission and nothing more is this totally stunning and vibrant cinematography and a score that throbs with menace and tension. That's what you get if you aren't willing to engage the film, and many people will call that a failure. However, let me say this. The times I am most affected by a film is when there is room for mystery, when there are gaps I must fill with my own feelings, experiences, and impressions. Refn declines to do any of that heavy lifting for us, to tell us what the movie is ultimately about, and some will say he has done a disservice to us for doing so, but I disagree. Leaving the cup half full, or half empty, as you may see it, lets the viewer pour a bit of themselves into the cocktail and personalize the drunk. You need to work a bit to find more here than pretty images and a good soundtrack, but the work can be rewarding. I came to see Julian as a man faced with impossible choices that make him a monster or a failure. He fantasizes about not being able to act, not being... There are films which serve as a buffet of story and ideas a viewer can place before themselves and be served. The film asks very little of the audience. It knows the aches and the pains and the escapist needs of the viewer, and so it says gently to them, "Don't get up. I've got this." And proceeds to serve the moviegoer until, and in many cases, beyond their fill. All is accounted for, mysteries are solved, loose ends get tied, and we get to go on a bit of a ride through it all, and we ooh and ah at the spectacle of it. These are the thrill rides of cinema. Only God Forgives is not one of these movies. Whether we are better for it is a matter of your tastes. Directed by budding auteur Nicholas Refn, who helmed the dark, brilliant, and nightmarish Drive, one expects a certain pretentiousness. There is more than a whiff of it all over Only God Forgives, and indeed, the film has polarized critics and audiences alike, with about half loving it and about half considering it art-house garbage. The movie contains the barest conceit of a plot. Small-time drug lord and kickboxing bookmaker Julian has been tasked by his gangster mother to avenge the death of his brother, and ends up confronting something like a force of nature in the character of Chang, a retired police inspector who has started meting out his own brand of justice while not singing karaoke at cop bars. The influence upon this film are obvious. You can draw fairly straight lines to grittier David Lynch work, Gaspar Noé, Enter the Void in particular, Chen Park Old Boy fame, and classic Asian crime dramas. Like Drive, it was also dedicated to Alejandro Jodorowsky, Refn being a new generation of art warriors inspired by the maniac Mexican. The pedigree of how it all comes together is very solid. Ryan Gosling is ostensibly the star of this film, but he probably speaks about 20 lines in the whole affair. Most of the time he is brooding, a living set piece after a fashion. His Julian comes off as a bit of an empty vessel. The real stars are Kristen Scott Thomas with a totally wackadoodle performance as Julian's trashy gangster mother, and Thai actor with the greatest of respect to this lovely Thai gentleman, Vitava being able to choose. His desire for bondage and non-interaction is a desire to be released from the consequences of his choices. When he succumbs to choice and attempts to take a stand against Chang, he is mercilessly emasculated. I really enjoyed that the director was willing to take this handsome, strong Ryan Gosling and just unman him. It was a bold choice and demonstrates the premise. Julian's dead brother had no problem making choices and didn't care about the consequences, and he was loved. Julian, the cautious child, the one who wants to tread lightly and who understands when you make a fist, it means people are getting hurt, is constantly being upstaged by his brother's memory. Not only is his brother willing to take merciless action, so is their nemesis, Chang. In many ways, we know Julian has no real chance. He was not made for the world he inhabits, and he will suffer for it. He wants the freedom only one man can really give him. Inaction is an action in and of itself, but requires a discipline that Julian lacks. He needs assistance from an unlikely source. Of course, I didn't get a sense of all this while I was watching the movie. I was absorbed in what was happening on the screen and wrapped up in the tension and the weird, liquid, smooth movements of Chang, certain, determined, relentless, and inevitable. This is what I had to pour into the half-empty vessel Refn put in front of me. I found myself coming back to certain imagery and trying to determine how I felt about it, and it frankly took a while to get a real sense of what I thought the movie meant. To me, this is an achievement of art over passive entertainment. There's a time to be spoon-fed mushy bananas, and there's time to enjoy a meal that will challenge your palate. I don't judge the former as harshly as some, but only God forgives is definitely the latter. To enjoy it, you will need to bring something to it, an offering of the self. Otherwise, the glass will only ever be half full.
Excellent job as always, Dave. I can't thank you enough for that. That was awesome. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that coinciding with this episode, we had an opportunity to talk to Larry Smith, the director of photography on Only God Forgives, and Bronson and Fear X. He's worked with Refn a few times. He also DP'd Stanley